Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History programs. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal and I'll be your host for the Living History programs. Today we're going to do part 4 of our series on the Middle East, the Cradle of Civilization. The Middle East is currently one of the most important and yet most troubled regions of the world. Apart from its importance as the main provider of energy supplies that keep the whole world going, it is a region that is responsible for so much instability and destruction through military conflicts. It is a region of the world that could decide the future of humanity, for it is said to be the setting for Armageddon, a prophecy on which Jews, Christians and Muslims agree, a battle that will bring about great destruction. Ironically, the Middle East was also the setting of the rise of civilization, a region that is accepted by almost all historians as the cradle of civilization. It is the region of the world that is central to the teachings of the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. A region that produced more prophets and reformers than any other part of the world. We have tried in this series of programs to explore the rich history of the Middle East, and it's been a 4-part program series. In part 1, we looked at the earliest human settlements and the rise of the Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia, current-day Iraq. In part 2, we looked at the earliest empires of the Middle East, from the Akkadian Empire to the Assyrian and Babylonian Empire, and touched on the Egyptian civilization also. Apart from amazing archaeological discoveries, these empires have fascinated us from their accounts in holy scriptures of Jews, Christians and Muslims. In part 3 of the programs, we explored in much more detail the Assyrian and Babylonian empires and their impact on the smaller but very significant Semitic population, the Hebrews or the Israelites. In part 4, in this program, and the last of the series, we are going to look at the amazing Egyptian civilization and its interaction with the Israelites and other great empires. And to do this, I'm joined by expert panelists, Arif, Ahmad and Amjad Hussain. Welcome. Assalamu alaikum again.
Wa alaikum salam.
Let's start off with the rise of the Egyptian power. Arif, maybe you could tell us about this great civilization of ancient Egypt.
I'm sure a lot of our listeners know or have heard of the Egyptian Empire, but just to give it a little bit of a summary, ancient Egypt is the longest lasting civilization in recorded history. For almost 3,000 years from its unification, around 3100 BC, to its conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, ancient Egypt was for the most part the preeminent civilization in the Mediterranean world. From the great pyramids of the Old Kingdom through the military conquests of the New Kingdom, Egypt's majesty has long entranced archaeologists and historians and created a vibrant field of study in all of its own, Egyptology. The main sources of information about ancient Egypt are the many monuments, objects, artifacts that have been recovered from archaeological sites, covered with hieroglyphics that have only been recently deciphered. The picture that emerges is one of a culture with few equals in the beauty of its art, the accomplishment of its architecture, or the richness of its religious traditions. Egypt has a long history which goes back far beyond the written word, the stories of the gods, all the monuments which made the culture famous. Evidence of overgrazing of cattle on the land, which is now the Sahara Desert, has been dated to around about 8000 BC. And this evidence, along with artifacts discovered, points to a thriving agricultural civilization in the region at that time. As the land was mostly arid even then, hunter-gatherer nomads sought to cool off the water source of the Nile River and began to settle there sometime prior to 6000 BC.
The history of Egypt is divided up between two different kinds of eras, and this are termed by historians as the kingdom periods and the intermediate periods. These are two significant divisions of history of Egypt. During the kingdom periods, all of Egypt was unified under one dynasty, And during the intermediate periods, Egypt was ruled through decentralized regional rulers. Amjad, if you could just take us through then the different periods, and then we'll start more specifically with the early dynastic period.
Well, basically, Dr. Mohammed Iqbal said the early dynastic period was circa 3100 BC to 2600 BC. The Old Kingdom, for instance, the age of the pyramid builders, is approximately 2681 to 2180 BC. The first intermediate period is regarded by historians to be 2181 to 2040 BC. The Middle Kingdom, for instance, the 12th, known as the 12th dynasty, is 2040 BC to 1720 BC. The second intermediate is regarded as 1720 to 1550 BC. The New Kingdom is known as 1550 to 10,069 BC. The third intermediate period, for instance, is circa 1085 to 664 BC. From the last period to Alexander's conquest, which is regarded by historians to be around 664 to 332 BC.
Now, these periods, some very significant things happened during the history of Egypt and the Egyptian civilization, and we're going to cover some of those in these programs. Just to say, in 525 BC, Kamses, king of Persia, defeated Psammethicus III, the last Scythe king, at the Battle of Pelusium in Egypt, and became part of the Persian Empire. And then, of course, as mentioned, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great of Macedonia defeated the armies of the Persian Empire and conquered Egypt. Prior to that, of course, the Assyrians had also entered Egypt as well and set their pharaohs as the vassals. So there was an earlier period even than the Persian and the Greek. So I'm just going back to yourself. Let's go through then now in detail through the early dynastic period, which covers the period 3100 BC onwards to 2686 BC. Just take us through this period, please.
Basically, Dr. Saab, this period saw the unification of the North and the South kingdoms under King Menses, also known as Mani.
So when we say the North and the South, listeners should really, this is to the Nile River. The division of Egypt as upper or north or south is based on the long trail of the Nile going onwards. But sorry, carry on.
No, absolutely, you're absolutely correct. I think it's important to visualize because you're looking at upstream, so you're looking at Nubia, so that is the upper kingdom.
So when Sudan and
so forth, and Nubia as it now, yes. And if you go towards the delta, which basically flows into the Mediterranean, and that is known as basically the Lower Egypt. So basically, this under this king known as Mani, or however you want to pronounce, is known by all these names, Manes or Mani. He unified the North and the South kingdoms in the period that you said.
So this is well in the early period when also the Sumerians were getting on with things. So Egypt wasn't that far behind really in its early development civilization. But sorry, go on.
So basically he became the first king of the first dynasty. So King Menes, he founded the capital of the ancient Egypt at White Walls, later known as Memphis, in the north and near to the apex of the River Nile Delta. The capital would grow into a great metropolis that dominated Egyptian society during the Old Kingdom period. The Archaic period saw the development of the foundations of Egyptian society, including the all-important ideology of kingship. To the ancient Egyptians, the king was a godlike being, closely identified with all-powerful god Horus of the horizons. The earliest known hieroglyphic writing also dates to this period. In the early dynastic period, as in all other periods, the most ancient Egyptians were farmers living in small villages, and agriculture, largely wheat and barley, formed the economic base of the Egyptian state. The annual flooding of the Great River Nile provided the necessary irrigation and fertilization each year. Farmers sowed the wheat after the flooding receded and harvested it before the season of high temperature and drought returned.
Arif, then we go on to the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders. Just take us through this phenomenal phase of Egyptian civilization. Now, sort of 2686 BC to around 2181.
That's correct, Dr. Sab, and this began with the third dynasty of pharaohs. Around 2630 BC, the third dynasty's king Djoser asked Imhotep, an architect, priest and healer, to design a funerary monument for him. And the result of that was the world's first major stone building, which is known as the Step Pyramid at Saqqara near Memphis. Saqqara, my apologies. Egyptian pyramid building reached its zenith with the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza, which is on the outskirts of Cairo. This was built for Khufu, or Cheops in Greek, who ruled between 2589 to 2566 BC. The pyramid was later named by the classical historians as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And the ancient Greek historian Herodotus estimated that it took 100,000 men 20 years to build it. So you see this scale of how big this was and how complicated it was. Now there's 2 other pyramids. They were also built at Giza for Khufu's successor, Khafra and Menkaure. They were around between 2558 and 2532 BC and 2532 to 2503 BC. During the 3rd and 4th dynasties, Egypt enjoyed a golden age of peace and prosperity. The pharaohs had absolute power and they provided a stable central government. The kingdom faced no serious threats from abroad, and successful military campaigns in foreign countries like Nubia and Libya added to its considerable economic prosperity. Over the course of the 5th and 6th dynasties, the king's wealth was steadily depleted, partially due to the huge expense of pyramid building, and his absolute power faltered in the face of the growing influence of the nobility and the priesthood that grew up around the sun god Ra or Re. After the death of the 6th dynasty's king Pepi II, who ruled for some 94 years, the Old Kingdom period ended in chaos.
Then we come to the first intermediate period, which is 2181 BC to 2040 BC. So on the heels of the Old Kingdom's collapse, the 7th and 8th dynasties consisted of a rapid succession of Memphis-based rulers until about 2160 BC, when the central authority completely dissolved, leading to civil war between provincial governors. This chaotic situation was intensified by Bedouin invasions accompanied by famine and disease. But then comes another glorious period, which is known as the Middle Kingdom. The 12th dynasty, which is sort of 2040 BC to 1720, and this had some very significant developments. Amjad, if you could take us through.
Also, basically, Egypt was reunified under Menhotep of Thebes, the ruler of the 11th dynasty. A new era known as the Middle Kingdom began. After he was assassinated, the throne passed on to his vizier, or the chief minister, who became king, and he was known by Amenhotep I, founder of the 12th dynasty. During the Middle Kingdom, Egypt once again flourished, as it had during the Old Kingdom. The 12th dynasty kings ensured the smooth succession of their line by making each successor co-regent, a custom that began with Amenhotep I.
So Thebes really became the center, which is really part of Upper Egypt, whereas Memphis was lower Egypt towards the delta, as you say. So, but carry on. Sorry, Amjad. Yeah.
The scholars who claim that the Middle Kingdom only truly began with the 12th dynasty do so because of the reign of Amenhotep I. And the culture his dynasty forged. His family would rule Egypt for the next 200 years, maintaining a strong, unified country and interacting significantly with neighboring lands. Amenhotep I's successor was Senusret I, who improvised the infrastructure of the country and initiated the kind of land-building projects which have characterized the Old Kingdom and represented the power of the king, including a temple to Amun at Karnak. Senusret I was succeeded by Amenhotep II, who may have ruled jointly with him, Little is known of Amenhotep II reign, but the reign of his son Sennacherib II is known for his good relations with the regional monarchs and increased prosperity of the country. It is interesting to note that under Sennacherib II reign especially, the local officials prospered just as they had towards the end of the Old Kingdom, and yet this did not cause the problems for the crown, which had been before basically those issues.
Now, Sennacherib II was succeeded by Sennacherib III, which is around 1878 to 1860 BCE, the most powerful king of the era whose reign, this is for the 12th dynasty, king of the era whose reign was so prosperous, he was deified in his lifetime. Sennacherib III is considered the model for the legend of Sesostris, the great Egyptian pharaoh who, according to Herodotus, campaigned in and colonized Europe, and according to Diodorus, conquered the entire known world. Sennacherib III is the best candidate as the basis for Sesostris, as his reign is marked by military expansion into Nubia and increase in wealth and power. Arif, just tell us a little bit about Sennacherib III, because it also relates to some biblical chronology, which I'll come to later on.
And that's great, Dr. Saab. And I suppose the best way of summarizing him is that Sennacherib III was the epitome of the warrior king, and he embodied the Egyptian cultural value of military skill and decisive action. At the head of his army, he was considered invincible. His campaigns into Nubia expanded Egypt's boundaries, and the fortifications he built along the border fostered trade. He also led an expedition into Palestine and afterwards increased trade relations with that region. Under the 12th dynasty, the kingdom also built diplomatic and trade relations with Syria, Palestine, and other countries. It undertook building projects, including military fortresses and mining quarries, and returned to pyramid building in the tradition of the Old Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom reached its peak under Amenhotep III, who was around between 1849 to 1797 BC, and its decline began under Amenhotep IV, who was from 1798 to 1790 BC, and continued under his sister and regent, Queen Sobek Neferu, who was around from 1789 to 1786 BC. She was the first confirmed female ruler of Egypt and was the last ruler of the 12th dynasty.
As I said, the 12th dynasty takes its importance also in relation to biblical chronology, which states that the land of Egypt started to have a very important relationship with the Hebrews, or the Israelites, as we term them quite often. And these were the descendants of Abraham and his grandson Jacob from around this period. Biblical historians believe that sometime between 2000 BC and 1700 BC, God told Abraham to leave his home. We covered this in part 2, I think, of the programs, where Abraham was believed to live in the Ur in the under the Chaldeans. And God had told him to migrate to Canaan, the promised land. But of course, because there was famine in Canaan, he migrated for a short period to Egypt as well. So you can see the linkage of the Hebrews and the Egyptians from that period. And biblical scholars trace this journey, and the account in the Bible is quite strange. Unfortunately, Egyptian scholars did not note of this interaction, but clearly Abraham was an important historical figure, and according to biblical texts. After some misunderstandings early on between Abraham and the Pharaoh, Abraham was given quite a bit of wealth and sheep and other things to go back to Canaan. So even though the Egyptian scripts do not mention him, it seems that he was only released and let go because he was respected and regarded highly. Amjad, just take us through again some of the biblical narrative in relation to Jacob and the tribes and how they relate to Egypt, because this is very important when we look at especially Joseph and his role in Egypt.
God had decided to change the name of Abraham's grandson from Jacob to Israel. Jacob was, as we all know, was blessed with 12 sons. They became the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's favorite son, however, Joseph, was receiving revelations and dreams and visions. And from a young age, one particular dream made his 10 brothers very jealous of him. The 10 brothers got so mad, they decided to get rid of him.
Now, this is covered both in the Quran as a holy scripture and the Bible in detail as well, although some of the details differ a little bit, but that was clearly, they were not happy and they did want to get rid of him, but go on.
Well, it had obviously quite consequences for Joseph, who ended up in Egypt, and the brothers told their father that Jacob was dead.
Joseph
was dead. Joseph grew up as a very handsome servant in the house of a prominent Egyptian official, but due to no fault of his own, he ended up in prison, where he gained a claim for interpreting dreams of the prisoners. As destiny would have it, the Pharaoh of Egypt had a particularly troubling dream, which no one could interpret adequately. So Joseph was basically summoned to interpret the dream. The account is presented in the book of Genesis, which is recorded in Genesis 14:15 to 16, and it reads, "And the Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you could understand a dream and interpret it." So Joseph answered to Pharaoh, saying, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace."
So the Pharaoh dreamt of 7 lean cows which devoured 7 fat cows, and of 7 withered ears of grain which devoured 7 fat ears. Joseph would be well known as an interpreter of dreams because 2 of King's key people had been put in prison at the same time as Joseph, and they had given accounts of their dreams, and Joseph had interpreted them brilliantly and absolutely right. So when one of these was released and went back, and the king had these dreams, nobody could interpret them, and suddenly thought, aha, I know this person who could interpret dreams. So when Joseph heard this dream of the Pharaoh, Joseph interpreted the dream as 7 years of abundance for the Pharaoh, followed by 7 years of famine. And he advised properly that the Pharaoh should stay the surplus grain. And lo and behold, just as it happened in the Nile Delta, this is exactly what happened, and the Pharaoh took the advice of Joseph, and of course he was rewarded. Arif, just take us through the period following the prediction. What happened?
So as you said, Joseph, obviously he was rewarded, and he became a vizier, and he was given the name of Zapanath Paneah, and he was also given Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, to be his wife. As predicted, during the 7 years of abundance, Joseph ensured that the storehouses were full and that all the produce was weighed. In the 6th year, Asenath bore 2 children to Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. When, as predicted, the famine came, it was so severe that people from surrounding nations came to Egypt to buy bread. The narrative also indicates that they went straight to Joseph or were directed to him, even by the Pharaoh himself. This is mentioned in Genesis verse 37 to 57. If we just quote a short extract of that, it says in Genesis, "Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. So you can see how much power was invested in Joseph by the Pharaoh himself.
This is a very interesting story and account, and shows how one of the great civilizations of that time had taken a weak Hebrew person, and based on his honesty and knowledge and wisdom that God had given to him, rose to become one of the top, really second highest to the Pharaoh himself in terms of governance and ruling, and how his family and his whole tribe's fortune had changed. So just as the dream had foretold, the famine came, and Joseph and his brothers had to migrate from Canaan to Egypt for food, as many other Hebrews did as well. And of course in the Bible you see the account of how he eventually forgave them and how they recognized him, and through his greatness many other people from Canaan migrated and settled in Egypt as they prospered. For the 3 billion or so Muslims, Christians and Jews that now inhabit this world, the story of Joseph is truly an inspirational and amazing story. It reveals how God helped and guided Abraham's descendants, the Hebrews. God had promised him a land, Canaan, but it was not fertile and ready for the Israelites, and they were made to migrate to Egypt, where they grew in numbers and prospered. God knew that the Hebrews wouldn't survive in Canaan because of the coming famine and other circumstances, and the circumstances were created such that favorable conditions would be made in Egypt where they could migrate. So it's truly quite amazing how God works. God ordained the situation with Joseph so that he would preserve the Israelites and fulfill his promise to Abraham. So I'm just take us through some of the reasons why or which Pharaoh may have been the Pharaoh of that time, because there's no clarity at the moment as far as historical and archaeological records go, but just take us some of the thinking.
Yeah, there is obviously subject to a lot of conjecture, although the Bible makes several references to the experience of the Hebrew Israelites in Egypt and the pharaohs of the time. And these pharaohs are not mentioned, obviously, by name.
The Bible just says the Pharaoh.
It just says the Pharaoh, the title of the king, basically, which was Pharaoh. So most scholars think Joseph lived in Egypt between 1900 BC to 1600 BC. So again, these are up debatable, the time scale as well as the Pharaoh. The historical period was known as the Middle Kingdom, and that lasts from 2000 to 1786 BCE, and this is one of Egypt's greatest times. There are 8 pharaohs during this time, of course, comprising Egypt's 12th dynasty. Some biblical historians believe that Joseph might have come to Egypt during the reign of Senusrot II, who was basically the pharaoh around 1894 to 1878 BCE.
Yeah. So the term Sesostris is usually as second. And other historians use the term we used, Sensoret the second, etc. So this terminology is changed, but basically it's the same. It's the same pharaoh, but
it's the same pharaoh. It's just how you pronounce it,
yeah,
basically.
Yeah.
Most likely begun his career, Senusrot III, around 1878 to 1841 BCE. So he lived in Egypt for 71 years. So Joseph died in approximately, it is estimated, around 1805 BC under the reign of Amenhotep III, who reigned basically from 1841 to 1797 BCE. According to Kings 6:1, the Exodus occurs around 480 years before the 4th year of King Solomon. Solomon's 4th year is basically regarded by historians as 966 BCE. So this basically places the Exodus at circa 1446 BCE. In Exodus 1240, for instance, says that Joseph went to Egypt 430 years before the Exodus, and that would be circa 1876. So, these are still debatable and, by historians and people who study the scriptures.
But one thing is quite clear, it was during the 12th dynasty of the Egyptian pharaohs that this seemed to have occurred. And whether you pronounce Sensoret or Sesostris, they're the sort of pharaohs pharaoh. It thinks that Joseph was around that period. So then we move to the second intermediate period in Egypt of chaos, which is around 1720 to 1550 BC. Arif, just take us through the period of...
The 13th dynasty marked the beginning of another unsettled period in Egyptian history, during which a rapid succession of kings failed to consolidate power. Around 1650 BC, a line of foreign rulers known as the Hyksos took advantage of Egypt's instability to take control. This group of people, they were mysterious people, most likely from the area of Syria or Palestine. And whilst the names of these kings are Semitic in origin, there's no definite ethnicity has been established. The Hyksos grew in power until they were able to take control of a significant portion of Lower Egypt in around 1720 BC, rendering the Theban dynasty of Upper Egypt almost a vassal state. The Thebans launched a war against the Hyksos around 1570, driving them out of Egypt, and the period after 1600 BC saw the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and the Levant become battlegrounds between the rival empires, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Elamites, and the Indo-European Mitannians and Hittites.
This is probably a good time to have a break, because in the next part we'll talk about the new kingdom and the civilization of Egypt marching forward from there onwards. You've been listening to the Voice of Islam Living History programs. Join us for the second part very shortly. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to part 2 of today's program, which is about the great Egyptian civilization. So this is part 4 of our Middle East series. And in part 1 of this program, we were talking about the great Egyptian civilization and its different dynasties and kingdoms. We'd covered up to the sort of second intermediate period, covering the rise of the great 12th dynasty, and then followed by the second intermediate period. And now we come to one of the most important phases of Egyptian history and the civilization of Egypt, and something that we are much more familiar with, because this was a period when the great Exodus also occurred in the Judeo-Christian traditions as well, and the Bible's full of accounts of what happened and how it happened. And archaeology and history, of course, has told us a lot as well of what was happening in Egypt and the rest of the Middle East there as well. So let's kick off then with the New Kingdom. This is around 1550 to 1069 BC, and it is the time of Imperial Egypt when it extended its reach beyond the former borders of Upper and Lower Egypt, within the Nile Delta and within the Nile River civilization. It is the most popular era in Egyptian history, in the present day, with the best known pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, such as Hatshepsut, a famous lady pharaoh, which we'll come to, and Thutmose the third, and Amenhotep the third, Akhenaten, and of course the great Ramses as well from the 19th dynasty onwards as well. So we're going to cover some of these pharaohs. Many of them were picked up by the Greek writers as well, who saw them as quite amazing figures as well. So Amjad, I'm going to start off with you for this important phase. Take us through the 18th dynasty and the founder of the 18th dynasty.
Basically, Amos I was the first king of the 18th dynasty. He reunited Egypt and initiated what is known as the period of the New Kingdom of Egypt, circa 1570 to 1069 BCE. This period once again saw great prosperity in the land under the strong and central government led by him. Within Egypt, imperial expansion was marked by significant construction of works on tomb building and temple complexes. was undertaken. Well, Amos I basically understood that Hyksos, who had been able to establish themselves so firmly in the land because they had been allowed to do so by the early Egyptian monarchs, he therefore decided to create a buffer zone between Egypt to secure the borders and fortified neglected settlements at key spots to guard the country. Amos I's struggle against the Hyksos brought him and his army into contact with the regions in Palestine and Syria, where he continued his campaign as well as leading military expeditions south against the kingdom of Kush in Nubia. When he died, he had consolidated his rule and secured the country, leaving a very stable political and economic situation for his successor, who was known as Amenhotep I.
So, Amenhotep I was succeeded by Thutmose I, and this is an important name in the dynasty. Thutmose I was 1520 to 1492, who again established quite a rule. Arif, do you want to take us through that period?
Yes, so Thutmose was around between 1520 to 1492 BCE. He initially put down a rebellion in Nubia, which broke out shortly after he came to the throne, and he personally killed the Nubian king and hanged his body from his ship's prow as a warning to the other rebels. He then expanded Egypt's hold on Nubia further south before turning his attention to Palestine and Syria. He added to the great temple of Karnak at Thebes and erected numerous other temples and monuments throughout Egypt. He was succeeded by his son, Thutmose II, who was around from 1492 to 1479 BCE. There's not much known about his reign, because he was instantly overshadowed by his more powerful half-sister, Hatshepsut. Thutmose II was the son of Thutmose I by a lesser queen, while Hatshepsut was Thutmose's first legitimate daughter, and according to her inscriptions, his designated heir. Thutmose II married Hatshepsut to secure his succession after Thutmose I's death, but no records survive which suggests that he ever had any real power. He may have ordered military expeditions into Syria, but he led none himself, and it is actually thought that these campaigns were commissioned by his half-sister or his wife.
Amjad, this half-sister, and I can't even say her name, so I won't even try, but she is very famous in what she did, what she achieved, one of the most powerful ladies in Egypt and rulers of Egypt. But just take us through this period.
Basically, Hatshepsut, whose reign was from 1479 to 1458 BCE, is among the most powerful and successful of the New Kingdom's monarchs. She had one child with Thutmose II, and he had another by a minor wife, whom he designated as successor. Thutmose III, whose reign was 1458 to 1425 BCE. Hatshepsut was named regent of Egypt upon Thutmose II's death, and she co-ruled with the child Thutmose III, but she had been the power behind her husband's reign and continued to do so as she thought best after his death. Hatshepsut is responsible for more building projects than any other Egyptian ruler except Ramesses the Great himself. Thutmose III was handed a prosperous and stable nation in 1458 BCE and took no time to begin improving upon it. It is Thutmose III who created the Egyptian empire, which would be maintained by his successors. He used war chariot inherited from the Hyksos, as well as bronze weapons and superior tactics.
I think just a point here, because it says he created the Egyptian empire. Historians view things differently. So Egyptians tended to rule within the Egypt as well as a great continuous civilization. But then they started expanding to other territories as well. And I suppose that's when it defined as an empire, as an expansionist body. So just to really state the difference in people use.
Absolutely, you're right. Actually, there are now many historians who regard that Egypt was the center of all the great African empire itself. So they just like United States, there's a capital Washington. I mean, the border stretched from Atlantic to the Pacific. So now people who are rewriting history, they say that Egypt was not just centered on Upper and Lower Egypt, but it was actually the center of all Africa. And that, of course, includes Libya, Syria, Egypt, and the Canaanite regions, all the way up to current Anatolia. Yes, it's obviously, history is developing as more archaeological facts come together. We, read more into the...
Sorry, you were going to talk about their war chariot, because that was a major...
Oh, yeah, the war chariot was the turning point. So he basically used the war chariot inherited from the Hyksos, as well as the bronze weapons and the superior tactics that they inherited, to defeat the surrounding nations and expand Egypt's dominions further than it ever reached in the past, kingdoms. So in 20 years, he had led at least 17 different military campaigns, subduing kingdoms from Libya to Syria into Egypt, made them basically Egyptian subjects, and extending Egypt's control into the south, from the area surrounding Buhin down to Kyrgyz. His inscriptions and monuments tell his story so complete that he's regarded as one of the best documented rulers in Egyptian history after Ramesses II.
So the reign of Amenhotep III, which is 1386 to 1353 BC, is also considered one of the most successful and powerful rulers of Egypt. Amenhotep III reigned over Egypt at one of its highest points culturally, politically, and economically. His reign is among the most opulent in the history of Egypt, and he consistently used his wealth in dealings with other countries to coax them into doing what he wanted. He maintained a stable rule of the country, expanded its borders, and devoted himself to the arts and buildings projects. Many of the most impressive Egyptian monuments come from his reign. He was succeeded by Amenhotep IV. Arif, do you want to take us through this period? It's a very important period.
Yes, so this ruler was around between 1353 to 1336 BC, and he's probably better known as Akhenaten. He was the pharaoh that was famous for instituting monotheism in Egypt and banishing the old gods. The time of his reign has come to be known as the Amarna period because the Egyptian capital was moved from Thebes to modern-day Amarna. He came to the throne as Amenhotep IV, but in the fourth or fifth year of his reign he changed his name to Akhenaten, and as I mentioned, he abolished the old religion, especially the cult of Amun, and he elevated the god Aten to the position of the one true god. Only the cult of Aten was viewed as a legitimate religious body. All the temples to other gods were closed and their worship proscribed. At the great temple of Amun in Karnak, which he also closed, he erected a temple to Aten, and as I mentioned, he moved the capital from Thebes to the new city which he had built. This is where he retired and largely neglected the affairs of state. So his reforms have long been regarded as a sincere effort at religious reformation, but they may have simply been his most effective solution to the problem of the growing power of the cult of Amun. As we mentioned before, the priests of Amun were a cause of concern to Akhenaten's father, whose efforts at curbing the cult failed, and Akhenaten effectively neutralized the power of the priests by outlawing their cult and banishing their god.
It's interesting. Some historians think that it may have been the impact of the Hebrews and Israel in their firm belief in one God that might have influenced this thinking. But alternatively, some historians and commentators have thought that the whole Hebrew story might be based on his thinking of monotheism and really picking up the idea from there. But historians and scientists never always agree on things, but God only knows the truth. So now we come to a very famous name of Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun was the young son of Akhenaten. Amjad, just take us through his and what we've learned, because his face is very famous.
Absolutely, yes. When Howard Carter discovered his tomb, basically, and he's probably one of the most well-known pharaohs ever in the world. Well, basically, upon Akhenaten's death, he was succeeded by his younger son, who was then known as Tutan Kheten, who softly changed his name to Tutankhamun and moved the capital back to Memphis and restored the religious center of Thebes, which has also held political significance. He reopened the temples that had been previously closed by his father and brought back the old religion to Egypt. Although he initiated important reforms which stabilized the country, he is best known for his magnificent tomb, which was, of course, discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter. Tutankhamun was married to his half-sister, Akhenaten, until his death at the age of approximately 18. Akhenaten may have then married the Vizier Ai, who, according to some scholars, succeeded Tutankhamun, and she may have tried to rule on her own at one period of time. A letter from her to the Hittite king reads and is well documented and asks for one of his sons in marriage, upon whom she would make an Egyptian king. Apparently, obviously, the vizier wasn't of the royal bloodline, so that's why she probably asked to marry into the...
In fact, this was the stage when the Hittites were at their peak of power, and the king Suppiluliuma I was written to him, and he sent his son, and of course they were deceived, and following that, they were, all hell broke loose because the Hittites basically wanted to invade Egypt and take revenge, etc. So a lot of blood was shed, and we'll come to a famous battle where they finally agreed to have one of the first treaties of the world. But let's really move on a little bit to another great ruler, because when Tutankhamun died, his widow, was faced with this situation, and she had to ally with all sorts of people. But after that dynasty, things moved to the dynasty of Ramesses the Great. Arif, maybe you could take us through this period, because this covered the period of 1279 to 1213. So Tutankhamun died around 1327 BC. So it wasn't too long before they could await another great pharaoh. Just take us through that.
No, it's about 50 years later. I suppose Ramesses the Great is known as the greatest ruler of the New Kingdom, and he belonged to the 19th dynasty. His Ramesses II is his title, but he was also known as Ramesses the Great. And he's probably the best known pharaoh of Egypt in the modern day because of his long association with the unnamed Egyptian ruler in the book of Exodus in the Bible, and because of his depiction in film adaptations of that story. The actual Ramesses II was not the pharaoh of the Exodus story, and there are a number of very strong arguments clarifying this.
I'm going to cover a few of those later on, but go on, carry on.
So among them is the fact that more than any other pharaoh in history, Ramesses documented his reign thoroughly. And this king left more monuments and inscriptions behind than any other. And yet nowhere in any of these is any mention of Hebrew slaves, plagues, or the mass migration of 600,000 people. So these are fairly significant events. You would have felt that they would have been mentioned somewhere. However, he did famously confront the Hittites, led by Mutawalli II at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, and this is considered to be one of the greatest battles of the ancient world. Although Ramesses claimed a great victory, the result was probably indecisive, and 16 years later, under Hattusil's III, the Treaty of Kadesh in 1258 BC, believed to be the first peace treaty in the world, was signed between the Hittites and the Egyptians. Egypt flourished under the reign of Ramesses II. He erected so many monuments and left behind so many manuscripts and inscriptions that there's no ancient site in the country which does not bear some mention of his name. In an effort perhaps to secure the northern regions of the country, he moved the capital from Thebes to a new city he built at Avaris called Per-Ramesses, also known as Per-Ramesu. He was believed to have been 96 years old when he died.
That's an amazing reign,
which is a very good age, and his people could not remember a time when he had not been king. His death obviously caused massive instability and widespread panic among the populace, who were facing a future without Ramesses as the king.
You mentioned earlier on, quite often people associate Ramesses with the Exodus, and of course the Ten Commandments film made that famous, but I don't think there is any real historical record to show that that was the Pharaoh. Interesting that the relationship of the New Kingdom pharaohs with the Hebrews was very different to the relationships that had been established during Joseph's time with the pharaohs for a variety of reasons. And I think some historians say one of that was the reign of the Hyksos, who were foreigners really who ruled Egypt, and I think the elite of Egypt never forgave themselves or anyone else for that. Because the origins are thought to have been from Canaan and around that area where the Israelites had also come, many people turned to them as the fifth columnists and troublemakers. So things within Egypt started changing, and around the time, of course, the Exodus and the arrival of Moses, things had got pretty bad as portrayed in biblical accounts and literature like that. The Egyptians started seeing all Semitic people as foreigners who could not be trusted. According to biblical chronology, the exodus of Moses and the Israelites from Egypt happened during one of the pharaohs belonging to the New Kingdom, but which one? Those scholars generally do not recognize the biblical portrayal of the Exodus as an actual historical event. Various historical pharaohs have been proposed as the corresponding rulers, and they vary a lot, including Ahmad the first, Amjad talked about earlier on, Akhenaten as well, but there are arguments against that as well, and of course Ramesses the second, as we've mentioned as well. Some think there's more realistic chance that it was Meneptah, around 1213 to 1203 BC.
It's basically, there's a competition between two scholars of the last century, namely Isaac Asimov, who is well known for working with Albert Einstein, and there is also basically a book written by Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst. He reckons he wrote a book basically Moses and the monotheism, and he reckons Akhenaten is the pharaoh at the time. Well, Akhenaten and Moses are one of the same, or maybe the pharaoh is Akhenaten at that time. So there is a lot of conjecture, there's a lot of debate, and it's not settled.
Yeah, and then the whole idea of, Moses as a baby, when he was saved by sort of princess of the Egyptians, which one was it? Some say it might have been, Amjad, you say the name,
Hatshepsut,
perhaps, who knows, Allah only knows. But one thing the Holy Quran also makes clear is that the pharaoh of that time when the Exodus took place was definitely drowned and his body was saved, and who knows what light science and history will shed on that in due course as well. So then we move to the third intermediate period, which is again a period of chaos in Egypt. Arif, if you could take us through this period, which lasted around 400 years, so that's quite a lot of chaos.
Yes, absolutely. And the time line is from 1085 to 664 BC. This period saw important changes in Egyptian politics, society and culture. The centralized government under the 21st dynasty, this saw pharaohs give way to the resurgence of local officials, while foreigners from Libya and Nubia grabbed power for themselves and left a lasting imprint on Egypt's population. In the 8th century BC, Nubian pharaohs, beginning with Shabako, ruler of the Nubian king of Kush, established their own dynasty. This is the 25th at the city of Thebes. And under Kushite rule, Egypt clashed with the growing Assyrian Empire. In 671 BC, the Assyrian ruler Esarhaddon drove the Kushite king Tarkara out of Memphis and destroyed the city, and he then appointed his own rulers out of local governors and officials who were loyal to the Assyrians.
So then we come really to the final stages, and that's the late period from Alexander's conquest, and preceded by, of course, Cyrus the Great. Just if you could take us through that period. We're coming towards the end of our program, so if you can make it brief.
Well, basically, in 525 BC, Cambyses, the king of Persia, defeated Sampithecus the third, and basically begun the era of the Persian rule of Egypt that lasted, through his successors, all the way up to Alexander. So we had the Egyptian king, all the famous kings, Xerxes, Darius, and so on, who were also the rulers of Egypt as well, until up to Alexander, when basically looking at 332 BC, Alexander the Great of Macedonia defeated obviously the Persian Empire and conquered Egypt. So Egypt became part of the Greco Empire. So after Alexander's death, Egypt was ruled by line of Macedonian kings, beginning with, of course, the famous general Ptolemy, who subsequently, as we all know, married Cleopatra, and against as the stuff of legends and films.
Yeah, so really, the Egyptians attempted to remain in the Near East, but they were kicked out of there as well. They lost their own lands in due course to the Persians and the Greeks as well. And really, it was a sad end to a great civilization. But overall, I think the Egyptian civilization has left some absolutely amazing records of their achievements, etc. So we come to the end of the famous Egyptian civilization. This has been quite a tour for us as well as presenters and people with interest in history. I hope listeners have found this 4-part series useful. Do please listen to all the programs. So when we started the program, in the first one we started looking at the Middle East from early human settlements, because once human beings, Homo sapiens, had migrated from Africa into Arabia and the surrounding areas, that's when they started settling as farmers, etc. And then the great cities were formed around Mesopotamia and the great Sumerian civilization. That led to the first empire of its kind, the Akkadian Empire, and great rulers like Sargon the Great, and great epics like Gilgamesh, etc. came from that part of the world. And we owe so much to the Sumerians in terms of the way we follow time, clock, cosmology, etc. The Babylonians and Assyrians added in a big way. So in the second part of this series, we looked at the great prophets, the great kings and the great empires, just touching briefly on the Assyrians, Babylonian, Egyptian empires, as well as the early Akkadian Empire. And in part 3, we looked in a lot more detail at the great achievements of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, and they really left a lot more in terms of documentation, in terms of monuments, and really retracing our history back to earliest times. We owe a lot to them, as do the Greeks, who picked up on history later on. And then, of course, we finished off in part 4 with the great Egyptian civilization as well, and all the contributions they made. It's been a fascinating, I think, journey. It is the journey of mankind. It is a journey of civilization. But one thing you learn from all this is that everything has a beginning and everything has an end. All empires eventually have their glorious times, but they come to an end. It is only God Almighty in His name that survives. Those Israelites were minor players in all these great civilizations of the time. And all those great civilizations of the time are buried under the sands, and we are starting to rediscover some of the achievements. But the Israelites kept going, and now, as I said, there are over 3 billion people as the children of Abraham. And of course, there are other people who may well be related to some of those early great patriarchs and prophets, etc. Humanity, in the end, will come down to a single humanity, just as it migrated from Africa religiously. It probably will as well. Please do give us your feedback. If you have a chance, go to the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk, and under programs, visit Living History. Listen to some of the programs. We hope you'll enjoy them. Any feedback would be welcome. We have a Twitter hashtag of VI Living History, so do give your feedback. Until our next program, I want to thank again Arif and Amjad for their contributions. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.